Hello, everybody. So this unit is ending just as it began, with rioting in the streets of New York. So this gives us kind of an opportunity to talk a little bit about what scholars understand about the causes and effects of urban riots in the United States. So in this lecture, I'm going to give you kind of an overview of some of the research that has been done on the phenomenon of urban rioting in the US in the 20th century. So, the scholarship on this topic in the US really begins with the 1960s, which was a period of unprecedented and thus far unequaled violence in American cities. In 1967, after major incidents in Detroit, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Newark, and that's just to name a few cities, the Johnson administration established the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, led by Otto Kerner Jr. The Kerner Commission, as it came to be called, studied the problem of urban riots and produced a report that has since become famous for its description of the problems that plagued mid century American cities. In its introduction, it said, "Our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Reaction to last summer's disorders has quickened the movement and deepened the division. Discrimination and segregation have long permeated much of American life. They now threaten the future of every American. This deepening racial division is not inevitable. The movement apart can be reversed. Choice is still possible. Our principal task is to define that choice and to press for a national resolution." The way the report describes the riots of the 1960s sound really, really similar if you read it to the Baldwin essay that we read for today. And the Baldwin essay was published, about a decade before the Carter Commission report. The two events are just so strikingly similar in their circumstances and in the diagnosis and results. Um, this report also could have just as easily been describing the riots that occurred in Miami in the 1980s, in Los Angeles and New York City in the 1990s, and even the events that have occurred within the past decade in Ferguson, Baltimore, Minneapolis, and Kenosha. Again, just to name a few cities that have experienced urban unrest in the last few years. Even as crime rates reached an all time low in the 1990s and 2000s, this kind of problem has remained a persistent issue of American cities. And indeed, the Kerner Report executive summary concludes with a quote from Dr. Kenneth B. Clark, who was one of the first witnesses to be interviewed by the commission. He said, "I read that report of the 1919 riot in Chicago, and it is as if I were reading the report of the investigating committee on the Harlem riot of 35, the report of the investigating committee on the Harlem riot of 43, the report of the McCone Commission on the Watts riot. I must again in candor say to you members of this commission, it is a kind of Alice in Wonderland, with the same moving picture reshown over and over again, the same analysis, the same recommendations, and the same inaction." Many of the riots studied by the commission also began, just like the 43 riot, in protest of a police shooting or by the arrest of somebody in circumstances that seemed unjust to the community. However, these events were also typically preceded by, to quote the report, an increasingly disturbed social atmosphere, in which typically a series of tension heightening incidents over a period of weeks or months became linked in the minds of many in the Negro community with a reservoir of underlying grievances. So, this is quite similar to the atmosphere that Baldwin describes in Harlem in the 1940s. And of the targets of the outrage, the report says that the civil disorders involved Negroes acting against local symbols of white American authority, society, and property in Negro neighborhoods rather than against white persons. So these were riots that predominantly targeted white owned businesses in Black neighborhoods. Furthermore, the overwhelming majority of the persons killed or injured in the disorders were Negro civilians. The reasons underlying the riots, according to the report, were pervasive discrimination and segregation in employment, education, and housing, Black immigration and white exodus, which have produced the massive and growing concentrations of impoverished Negroes at our major cities, and the Black ghettos, where segregation and poverty converge on the young to destroy opportunity and enforce failure. That all of this was also occurring during the post war economic boom, in which white Americans and even some Black people, quote, have prospered to a degree unparalleled in the history of civilization, contributed to feelings of bitterness and anger. There's a sense of expanding opportunity, of expanding wealth, and yet most African Americans are prevented from actually participating in it and accessing the benefits of it. Likewise, the successes of civil rights legislation and the abolition of Jim Crow in the 50s and 60s led to heightened expectations that were frustrated by the deplorable conditions of the quote unquote ghetto. The report also describes the deterioration of the relationship between African American communities and the police. It says that to some Negroes, police have come to symbolize white power, white racism, and white repression. And the fact is that many police do reflect and express these white attitudes. The atmosphere of hostility and cynicism is reinforced by a widespread belief among Negroes in the existence of police brutality and in a double standard of justice and protection, one for Negroes and one for whites. And as you likely know, this remains quite true in the United States in 2021. The commission also made several recommendations to the government, including the establishment of neighborhood task forces to establish more effective communication between communities and the government, greater accountability for the police, and new investment in employment, housing, and education for African Americans. But most significantly, the report declared that the only real solution to the problem of urban violence was the integration of these two separate segments of society. It said, the primary goal must be a single society in which every citizen will be free to live and work according to his capabilities and desires, not his color. What's more, the Commission predicted that without such reforms, American central cities would continue their decline, and American society, the segregation of white from black, would become further entrenched, and that this would provide further fuel for riots and for extremism. It said that in several cities, increasing polarization is in evidence, with continuing breakdown of interracial communication and growth of white segregationist or black separatist groups. We recognize that the continuation of disorders and the polarization of the races would provide fertile ground for organized exploitation in the future. So, subsequent scholarship has backed up the Kerner Commission's findings on the causes of the American riots. Um, there's not a lot of disagreement on why exactly this happened, but there is substantially less agreement on its effects. And the most fundamental thing that scholars, politicians, and activists really want to know about urban riots is whether collective violence works as a political strategy or whether it is inherently self defeating. So, in a 1977 study of the political effects of the urban riots of the late 60s, James Button described three different approaches to understanding the nature and impact of collective violence. The first, or conservative view, holds that collective violence is inherently irrational and deviant. So you'll see lots of references to mob mentality or mob behavior, the idea that people lose their reason in a crowd. Um, they hold that it's irrational and deviant, and that it really achieves nothing politically for the rioters. That it is inherently self-defeating. Conservative responses, therefore, tend to be mostly aimed at crime control, so law and order measures aimed at deterring future uprisings, while also shoring up traditional institutions such as the church and the family. The second, liberal or sometimes called moderate view, holds that violence is just kind of the unfortunate outcome of social conditions, the answer to which is the amelioration of contributing structural factors through a mix of police measures and socioeconomic reforms. So, this liberal view also tends to take for granted the idea that collective violence is undesirable and that its primary effect is really to provoke a conservative backlash, which liberals also see as undesirable. So, riots are bad, both because they destroy stuff and endanger people, and also because they prompt conservatives to overreact in the other direction, leading to a ramp up in policing, more weapons on, in the cities, and therefore more violence, a kind of vicious cycle. The final radical, sometimes called militant view, interprets collective violence as basically structured, purposeful, rational, and politically meaningful. So, deployed as a last result when conventional methods of protest have failed to achieve the desired outcome, the blame for collective violence rests with those in power, and the only remedy is for those in power to make concessions to the groups that they have oppressed. So what differentiates the radical view from the other two is in this view about the utility of violence or the rationality of violence, whereas conservative and liberal views would tend to basically adhere to this idea that riots are irrational. It's, bad behavior that we ought to try to deter in some way, whether it's through reform or through more policing. Um, Rather, the radical view would say that actually violence can be quite rational. It can be deployed in politically intentional and politically meaningful ways in order to extract concessions from the people in power. The Kerner Commission report, as should be pretty clear, was solidly within the liberal frame of reference, kind of taking for granted that violent uprisings are counterproductive. And this conventional wisdom about what happened after the report is generally seen as supporting this backlash hypothesis, the idea that riots provoke a conservative overreaction. Just to kind of sum up the events that happened after this, President Johnson largely failed to act on any of the commission's recommendations. He pretty much just ignored it. And just a month later, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And this set off a wave of further riots in more than 100 US cities. Later presidents would tend to treat this issue of urban unrest primarily, again, as a crime problem. This was the age of Nixon, of Reagan, et cetera. And they address the issue through policing and riot suppression, actions that liberals have tended to see as unfortunate, again, but entirely predictable, because this is what happens when people are scared. This conventional wisdom concerning riots also emerged again in response to the urban unrest during the summer of 2020. When African American Congressman and civil rights activist James Clyburn said that he and John Lewis, another African American congressman, feared that the slogan defund the police could undermine the Black Lives Matter movement, just as burn baby burn, which is a slogan that emerged during the Watts riots in the 60s, destroyed our movement back in the 60s. Button's study, however, is among the first to complicate this idea that collective violence is always self-defeating, and he suggests, among other findings, that the very existence of the Kerner Commission shows that officials interpreted the 1960s riots as, he says, politically purposeful events, and that these officials did make effort, both at the local and national levels, to temporarily ameliorate the conditions in African American neighborhoods, even if the reforms didn't really last or were kind of wiped out by the economic upheaval of the 70s. They at least did make an effort. So concessions were made to what the rioters wanted. Other studies, however, do find support for the idea that riots provoke more backlash on the part of institutions and the larger society, and that this really outweighs any concessions that are extracted from the people in power by the rioters. So, for example, I'm just going to give a few examples here. A 2016 study by Noli Brazil finds a statistically significant relationship between riots and the acceleration of the white flight phenomenon. This is where scared white people move out to the suburbs and leave the central cities, again, leaving a kind of just a quite impoverished Black population behind. In 1975, Susan Welch found that cities responded to riots by increasing expenditures in areas assumed to be of concern to those demanding control and punishment of rioters, and to a much lesser extent in areas assumed to be of concern to those rioting. In that same vein, Elaine Sharp in 2006 found that the riots of the 1960s were associated with an increase in the size of a city's police force, an effect that persisted almost 40 years later. Additional papers have been more equivocal, finding a lack of strong support for the backlash hypothesis or for the radical point of view that rioters were successful at getting what they wanted. For example, a follow-up to Welch found neither, found neither support for the idea that the rioters' demands were met, or and found less convincing support for Welch's claim that city governments favored expanding programs to control and punish rioters. Rather, even over a time of trauma within the political environments of cities, the guiding principles of expenditure determination remained basically intact. The economics research appears to be a little bit more definitive and suggests that, in what you would assume, Unrest is bad for business, and it leads to a decline in sales and property values, which results in an erosion of the tax base, which in turn makes services to the community more difficult to finance, which again leads to further deterioration of the neighborhood, which becomes less attractive for investment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, basically, it's very, very bad. The economic impact is bad across the board. So, for example, a 2004 study by Matheson and Bod found that in the decade following the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles, a continued loss of taxable sales has translated into a cumulative loss of at least 3.8 billion in taxable sales and over 125 million in direct sales tax revenue losses. In 2007, Collins and Margot found a statistically significant relationship between the 60s riots and a decline in the value of Black owned property in central cities. And in another paper, the same authors found that the riots were associated with both a long and short run decline in Black income and employment. So as you can probably tell, this topic is really complex and controversial, and there's evidence that points in some rather contradictory directions. Although it seems pretty clear that riots are bad for the economy, it's really difficult to do justice to just how deep this scholarship goes in a short lecture. However, this little literature review hopefully provides enough of an overview for you to begin to understand some of the questions that researchers ask and the assumptions that have informed it. So if you are interested in exploring it further, this should give you a place to start. I would also note that while the social science research is useful for examining empirical effects, it doesn't really begin to address the psychological and moral questions that Ellison and Baldwin's actual experience of the 1943 Harlem riot prompted them to consider. And so, in our discussion, we should really consider what perspective on urban unrest these two authors reflect and what their very personal accounts add to our understanding of this phenomenon. And finally, I'll just say that while the racial segregation identified as the core of the civil unrest we have seen in America, while that may be in many ways a uniquely American problem, we have, of course, seen eruptions that have shaken the foundations of many world cities, including just in the past year, Paris and Delhi. So, where human beings were gathered together in high densities and where there are conditions of extreme inequality, and maybe a feeling that there is no viable political path for expressing grievance, violence is a threat. And so, in many, many contexts, it's a problem that people are trying to understand.